The twin suns of Surath Prime rose slowly over the crystal towers of the capital city, and High Mediator Thesley stood at her window watching the light dance through the ancient spires that her ancestors had built 3,000 years ago. Was tall and slender like all Valani, with skin that glowed softly in shades of blue and purple, and her large dark eyes reflected the beauty of her world. As she prepared for another day of peaceful governance, the Valani had never known war, and they had never needed weapons because their civilization was built on art and philosophy and the gentle exchange of ideas. Across the Starsty traded medicines that could cure diseases on 100 worlds, and they created music that could make even the coldest species weep with joy. And they believed that all intelligent life shared a common desire for peace. Thesley smiled as she watched children playing in the gardens below, their laughter rising up to her chambers like the sweetest song she had ever heard. She could not have known that this would be the last peaceful morning her world would ever see. The first warning came as a whisper through the communication networks, a confused report from the outer monitoring stations about strange shadows blocking out the distant stars. Thesley called for more information, but the stations had gone silent, and a cold feeling began to spread through her chest as she waited for answers that would not come. In the sky, Chang'ed's twin suns seemed to flicker as something vast moved between them and the planet, and Thesley watched in horror as thousands upon thousands of black ships emerged from the darkness of space. They came in waves that seemed to have no end, angular vessels covered in sharp spines and weapons that pulsed with sickly green light, and they descended upon Surath Prime like a plague of insects, hungry for flesh. Kefir had arrived. Thesley had heard stories about the Kefir, whispered tales that she had dismissed as exaggerations meant to frighten children, but now she understood that the stories had not told even half the truth. They were a swarm species, insectoid creatures with armored bodies and mandibles that could tear through metal, and they had consumed world after world for longer than anyone could remember. They did not negotiate, and they did not show mercy, and they did not stop until everything in their path had been destroyed. First attack ships reached the capital within minutes, and Thesley heard the screams begin as green fire rained down from the sky. The beautiful crystal towers that had stood for millennia shattered like glass, and the gardens where children had been playing moments ago became fields of ash and death. Thesley ran through the corridors of the meditation hall, shouting orders that no one knew how to follow because her people had no soldiers and no battle plans and no concept of organized defense. She found Eldam Ravine trying to establish communication with the other cities, his old hands shaking as reports of destruction flooded in from every corner of the planet. They are everywhere, Maravine said, his voice breaking with despair, and we have nothing to fight them with. Thesley grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the emergency shelters as explosions rocked the building. Around them, we must get the people to safety, she shouted over the noise, and we must call for help from the Galactic Concord. But even as she spoke those words, she knew in her heart that help might never cometh. Galactic Concord was a union of dozens of species that had promised to protect each other from threats. But the Valani had seen how the Concord operated when danger appeared. They held meetings that lasted for months while worlds burned, and they calculated costs and benefits while innocent people died, and they found excuses to do nothing when action was needed. Thesley reached the communication center and began transmitting emergency signals to every member of the Concord, begging them to send ships and soldiers and anything that could help her people survive. Responses came slowly, and each one carried the same message, wrapped in different words of sympathy. The Valorians expressed deep concern, but noted that their fleet was needed to protect their own borders. Thmandari offered thoughts and prayers, but explained that they could not risk conflict with the Kefir swarm. The Crystalline Collective analyzed the situation and determined that intervention would be strategically unwise. Species after species turned away from the burning world, leaving the Valani to face extinction. Alana Thesley felt tears streaming down her glowing face as she watched her city collapse through the observation screens, and she saw families running through the streets while fire fell from above. She saw elders trying to shield children with their bodies, and she saw artists clutching their final works as death came for them, and she saw everything her people had built crumbling into dust. Is there no one who will help us? She whispered into the void. Moravin placed a hand on her shoulder his expression empty with grief as another tower fell in the distance. "We are alone," he said, "and we will die alone." But Thesley refused to accept that fate for her people, and she turned back to the communication systems, with a desperate idea forming in her mind if the civilized species of the galaxy would not help. Then perhaps she needed to call someone else. She remembered the warnings that the Concord had issued about a young species on the edge of known space, a species that had been quarantined and isolated because the other races considered them too dangerous to interact with. They were called humans, and the Concord described them as violent and unpredictable and far too willing to use for Seth. Other species feared them and kept them locked away like wild animals that might attack at any moment. Thesley had always accepted the Concord's judgment about humanity, but now she wondered if violent and willing to use force might be exactly what her people needed. She programmed a new transmission, a desperate plea broadcast on every frequency that could reach the distant world called Earth. "Please," she said into the transmitter, her voice raw with emotion. "We are dying and no one will help us, and we have nowhere else to turn." She sent images of the burning cities and the fleeing refugees, and the Kepler ships darkening the sky. "We are the Vellani of Surath Prime, and we are asking anyone who can hear this message to save us." The transmission launched into space, racing across the light years toward a species that the galaxy had called monsters. Thesley did not know if anyone would answer, and she did not know if help would arrive in time, and she did not know what kind of creatures might respond to her cribbit. She knew that her people were dying, and she knew that she had to try everything, and she knew that sometimes the only hope left was the kind that seemed impossibly outside her window. The capital city burned, and the screams of her people filled the night, and the Kepler swarm descended like a wave of darkness that would consume everything in its path. Thesley watched and wept and waited for an answer that might never come. Far away, beyond the stars that the Concord had claimed for themselves, the message reached a small blue planet where a young species heard the cry of strangers, begging for their lives, and something stirred in the hearts of those who listened. Commander Marcus Cole was finishing his morning coffee in the mess hall of the orbital station when his communicator began. Screaming with emergency alerts was a tall man with gray at his temples and scars on his hands from 30 years of military service, and his dark eyes had seen enough combat to recognize the sound of a crisis. Before anyone spoke a word, he moved quickly through the corridors toward the command center, passing soldiers who were already running to their stations with the same urgent energy that filled the entire base. Something had happened. Something big enough to wake up the entire United Terran Military Council. In the middle of the night, Cole entered the war room and found Admiral Chen standing before a massive holographic display, her face pale as she watched images that made even the hardened officers around her look away. The transmission from Surath Prime played on every screen, showing crystal cities collapsing under green fire and civilians running through streets filled with smoke and death. The voice of a Vellani woman echoed through the room, speaking words that needed no translation because fear and desperation sounded the same. "In every language, we are dying and no one will help us." Cole watched a Vellani child clutching its parent as flames consumed the building behind them, and he felt something twist in his chest that he had not felt in years. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Admiral Chen pulled up data files on the species, showing images of the tall glowing beings and the peaceful civilization they had built. "They are called the Vellani," she said, "and they are members of the Galactic Concord that has spent 60 years telling us we are too dangerous to join their precious alliance." The bitterness in her voice was clear, and Cole understood why she felt that way. Humanity had reached for the stars with open hands, eager to meet other species and share in the wonders of the galaxy. But the Concord had rejected them again and again. They called humans violent because humans had fought wars among themselves, and they called humans primitive because humans still believed in defending the weak. With Forseth Concord had drawn a line around human space and told them to stay inside like prisoners who had committed no crime. "The Concord has asked for nothing," Chen continued, pulling up diplomatic channels that remained empty. "And the Vellani sent this transmission to everyone, including us, because no one else would answer." General Morrison stepped forward, His arms crossed and his expression hard as stone. Why should we care? He demanded. These are the same species that voted to keep us quarantined and called us monsters, and treated us like we were diseases that might spread if they let us out. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, and Cole understood the anger that drove them. Humanity had offered friendship to the galaxy, and the galaxy had responded with fear and isolation. Let them burn, Morrison said, and let the Concord see what happens when they refuse to build militaries. Because violence is beneath them. Cole stared at the holographic image of the burning world, watching as another tower fell and more lives were lost in the Flamesh. Thought about his daughter, who had asked him once why humans were kept separate from the other species, and he remembered telling her that sometimes people feared what they did not understand. Thought about his grandfather, who had served in the last great war on Earth, fighting against those who believed that some lives mattered less than others. He thought about every soldier who had ever worn the uniform, standing between the helpless and those who would harm them. They are dying, Cole said, his voice cutting through the argument like a blade. And they asked for help. Morrison turned to face him with frustration burning in his eyes. They are strangers who hate us, Morrison replied, and we owe them nothing. Cole stepped toward the holographic display and pointed at the image of civilians fleeing through the streets. Those are not politicians, he said, and those are not diplomats who voted against us and called us names we did not deserve. He pointed at a group of children being carried by adults who were trying to shield them from the fire above. Those are families, Cole continued, and those are mothers and fathers and sons and daughters who have done nothing wrong except be born on a world that someone decided to destroy. The room fell silent as Cole turned to face the council, with determination written across his weathered face. 60 years ago, the galaxy told us we were monsters because we fight, he said. And today they will learn what kind of monsters we really are. Admiral Chen studied him for a long moment, and Cole could see the conflict in her eyes as she weighed politics against principle. If we do this, she said slowly, we will be defying the Concord's quarantine and risking a diplomatic incident that could have consequences for generations. Cole nodded, accepting the weight of that truth. And if we do nothing, he replied, we prove that the Concord was right about us all along. Chen looked around the room at the officers who had gathered, soldiers who had trained their entire lives for battles they might never fight. This is not an order, she said, and I will not force anyone to volunteer for a mission that may cost them everything. Cole watched as hands began to rise around the room, one after another, until every officer was standing with their arm raised. We are soldiers, a young lieutenant said from the back of the room, and soldiers do not ignore people who are crying for help. Within hours the call had gone out across every human military base and every ship in the fleet, and volunteers flooded in faster than the systems could process. The Marines left their families with promises to return, and pilots reported to their squadrons with fire in their hearts, and medics packed supplies while memorizing everything they could learn about Valandi biology. 1st Expeditionary Fleet assembled in orbit around Earth, 47 ships carrying 12,000 soldiers who had chosen to risk their lives for people they had never met. Cole stood on the bridge of the flagship as the fleet prepared to enter slipspace, watching his home planet grow smaller in the view screen. His first officer approached with a tablet, showing the final personnel reports. Everyone is aboard and ready, she said, though I should mention that we have 3 times more volunteers than we can actually take. Cole smiled despite the weight on his shoulders, feeling pride in his species that burned brighter than any star. That is humanity, he said, and that is why the Concord fears us. He activated the ship-wide communication system and addressed the fleet that was about to make history. Listen carefully, he said, because I want every one of you to understand what we are about to do. He paused, letting the silence stretch across thousands of soldiers waiting for his words. The galaxy thinks we are violent and dangerous and primitive, to be trusted with the responsibility of civilization, he continued, and today we will show them exactly how violent and dangerous we can be. His voice hardened with conviction as he spoke his final words. Before the jump, we are going to save those people, and we are going to destroy anyone who tries to stop us, and we are going to teach the galaxy what happens when you hurt someone who cannot fight back. The fleet entered slipspace, racing across the stars toward a world in flames. carrying the answer to a desperate prayer. Wolves were coming and they were hungry for justice. The Kefir swarm commanders had conquered 47 worlds in their lifetime, and they had never encountered a problem they could not solve. By throwing more soldiers at it, they floated in the command chamber of the mothership, their segmented bodies clicking with satisfaction as they watched the Vilani civilization collapse. Beneath their assault, prey species was soft and weak and delicious in its terror, and the swarm would feast well on this world before moving on to the next war leader. Krethix extended its awareness through the neural network that connected every Kefir mind, feeling the joy of millions of warriors as they tore through the crystal cities below. This world will fall within 3 cycles, Krethix announced to the other commanders, and then we will harvest the remaining population for food and labor. The other commanders clicked their mandibles in agreement, already calculating how many eggs could be laid in the fertile lands once the natives were eliminated. None of them noticed the disturbance at the edge of the system until it was too late. 47 ships emerged from slipspace like bullets fired from a gun, their engines burning hot as they accelerated directly toward the swarm fleet. Kefir sensors struggled to identify the newcomers because they did not match any species in the database. The ships were crude and angular, covered in thick armor plates and bristling with weapons that looked almost primitive compared to the elegant designs of the Concord species. But there were so many weapons, more than any sane species would mount on vessels that size, and they were all pointed directly at the swarm war leader. Krethix felt confusion spreading through the neural network as commanders tried to understand what was happening. Identify the intruders, Krethix commanded, and demand their surrender. The communication officers sent the standard greeting that the swarm used when encountering new species, a message that promised swift death if the newcomers did not submit. Immediate response came in a language the translation systems had never processed before, harsh and sharp and filled with sounds that seemed designed for shouting. "This is Commander Marcus Cole of the United Terran Fleet," the voice said, "and we are here for the Vilani." Krethix felt something strange crawl through its exoskeleton, an unfamiliar sensation that took several moments to identify. It was uncertainty. "You will withdraw," the voice continued, "or you will die." The swarm had heard threats before from species that thought they could resist, and every single one of those species had been consumed and forgotten. Krethix ordered the nearest attack wing to intercept the human ships and teach these newcomers the price of defiance. 300 Kefir vessels changed course to engage. The tiny human fleet never reached their targets. Human ships opened fire with weapons that roared across the void like thunder, sending streams of metal and energy into the swarm formation. With terrifying accuracy, their vessels exploded in brilliant flashes of light, their crews dying before they could even report what was happening. Humans did not fight like any species the swarm had encountered before. They did not maintain safe distances or calculate optimal engagement angles or retreat when the odds seemed unfavorable. They flew directly into the swarm formation with their guns blazing, accepting damage that would have made any rational species flee, and they kept coming no matter how many of them fell within minutes. The attack wing had been reduced to debris floating in the darkness, and the human fleet was already moving toward the planet below. Krethix watched in disbelief as enemy ships descended through the atmosphere, ignoring the ground defenses that tried to stop them on the surface. High Mediator Thesley huddled with hundreds of refugees in a collapsed building that had once been a school for young artistes, had not slept in days, and her bioluminescent skin had faded to a dim gray as hope drained from her exhausted body. Kefir ground forces were closing in on their position, and she knew that death was coming for all of them. Then she heard a sound that did not belong to the nightmare around her, a roaring from the sky that was different from the whine of Kefir ships. Looked up through a hole in the ceiling and saw metal objects falling through the smoke, and fire like stars made of steel. They crashed into the rubble around the refugee camp with impacts that shook the ground, and for a moment Thesley thought that the Kefir had found a new way to kill them. Then the objects burst open. Figures emerged from the smoke, bipedal creatures wearing heavy armor that covered them from head to foot, carrying weapons that looked like nothing Thesley had ever seen. They moved with a speed and purpose that seemed impossible, spreading out to form a barrier between the refugees and the approaching Kefir force zone of the creatures stopped in front of Thiesley and removed its helmet, revealing a face that was both strange and somehow familiar. It was a female with brown skin and dark eyes that burned with an intensity that made Thiesley's breath catch in her throat. "Are you the ones who sent the message?" the female asked, her voice rough but not unkind. Thiesley nodded, too shocked to form words as she stared at the first human she had ever seen. "I am Sergeant Elena Vasquez of the Terran Marines," the female said, "and we are here to help." Behind her, more humans were pouring out of the drop pods, setting up defensive positions, and helping wounded Villani to their feet. A Villani elder grabbed Thiesley's arm with trembling hands. "Who are they?" he whispered with fear and wonder mixed in his voice. Before Thiesley could answer, the Kefir forces appeared at the edge of the camp, hundreds of insectoid warriors charging toward the refugees. With their mandibles clicking in anticipation, Sergeant Vasquez put her helmet back on and raised her weapon. "Get behind us," she shouted to the Villani, her voice amplified by her armor. "We have got you." The humans opened fire. Thiesley had never seen violence like this, had never imagined that such destruction could be unleashed by living beings. Human weapons roared continuously, cutting down Kefir warriors faster than she could count, and the soldiers moved together like parts of a single machine. When a Kefir broke through the line, a human would tackle it to the ground and fight it with bare hands until another soldier could finish it off. When a human fell wounded, others would drag them to safety while still firing at the enemy. They fought with a ferocity that should have been terrifying, but Thiesley felt no fear as she watched them. She felt something she had not experienced since the first Kefir ships appeared in the sky. She felt protected. The battle lasted less than an hour, and when it was over, the ground was covered with Kefir bodies, and the refugees were still alive. Sergeant Vasquez approached Thiesley with blood on her armor and exhaustion in her eyes. "Are you hurt?" she asked, checking Thiesley for injuries with practiced efficiency. "No," Thiesley managed to say, "but I do not understand." She looked at the human soldiers who were already treating Villani wounded and distributing food and water to the refugees. "Why did you come?" she asked. "The Concord told us your species was dangerous and violent and not to be trusted." Vasquez smiled, and despite the death that surrounded them, it was a warm and genuine expression. "They were right about the violent part," she said, "but they got one thing wrong." She gestured at her fellow soldiers who were working to save lives. Even as more fighting erupted in the distance, "We are not dangerous to people who need help," Vasquez said. "We are dangerous to people who hurt them." Thiesley felt tears forming in her large dark eyes as she finally allowed herself to believe that her people might survive. "Thank you," she whispered. Vasquez nodded and began reloading her weapon as reports of more Kefir forces came through her communicator. "Do not thank us yet," she said. "The war is just getting started." Above them, human ships dueled with Kefir vessels across the burning sky, and the sound of battle echoed across a world that was no longer fighting alone. 9 days. For 9 days, the battle for Surath Prime raged across every continent and ocean and sky, and for 9 days the humans refused to give up even a single meter of ground. Kefir had never faced anything like this, had never encountered a species that seemed to grow stronger the harder they were pushed. Every time the swarm thought they had broken the human lines, the soldiers would reform and counterattack with a fury that defied all logic. Corps leader Krethix watched the battle, reports with growing horror as the impossible continued to happen. Humans were losing soldiers every hour, their crude ships taking damage that should have crippled any fleet, and yet they kept fighting as if death itself could not stop them. "Why do they not retreat?" Krethix demanded, unable to comprehend what was happening. "They cannot possibly win against our numbers." But the humans did not seem to care about numbers or odds or any of the calculations that governed rational warfare. In the northern continent, Private First Class Elena Vasquez discovered a group of Villani elders trapped in a collapsed temple. While fire rained from the sky, the building was surrounded by Kefir forces, and anyone could see that attempting a rescue was suicide. Vasquez did not hesitate for even a second. She fought her way into the temple alone, killing 17 Kefir warriors with her rifle and her knife and her bare hands. When her weapons ran empty, she found the elders huddled in a prayer chamber, too weak from hunger and fear to walk on their own. The largest elder weighed nearly twice what Vasquez did, but she carried him on her back for 3 kilometers through burning forests. While bleeding from wounds that should have killed her when her squad found her, she was still walking, still carrying the elder, still refusing to stop until every refugee with Safith medics had to physically restrain her so they could treat her wounds in the eastern mountains. Sergeant James Okonkwo received orders to hold a narrow pass, while civilian evacuations proceeded through the valleys behind his position. He had 7 soldiers under his command, and intelligence reported at least 1,000 Kefir warriors moving. Toward the pass, any reasonable officer would have requested reinforcements or planned a tactical retreat. Akwo smiled and told his soldiers to dig in. He held that pass for 14 hours of continuous fighting against waves of enemies that seemed to have no end. 14 hours of watching friends fall and refusing to mourn because there was no time for grief. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Okonkwo still standing at his position with an empty rifle in one hand and a Kefir blade in the other. Had killed so many enemies that their bodies formed a wall in front of his trench. "You are relieved, Sergeant," the reinforcement commander said with awe in his voice. Okonkwo looked at the valley behind him, where thousands of Villani civilians had escaped to safety. "Yes, sir," he replied. "I believe we are." Then he collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion across the planet. Stories like these multiplied beyond counting. Combat medics worked for days without sleep, learning Villani biology through trial and error while enemy fire exploded around them. They lost patience because they did not understand how Villani bodies functioned, and they wept over those losses even as they moved to save the next life. Dr. Sarah Chen performed surgery on a wounded Villani child while a battle raged outside the field hospital. She did not know if the procedure would work because no human had ever operated on a Villani before. She succeeded through sheer stubborn refusal to let her patient die. Pilots flew missions that should have been impossible, navigating through swarms of enemy fighters to deliver supplies and reinforcements to cut off positions. Lieutenant Marcus Webb crashed his damaged ship into a Kefir command vessel when his weapons failed, sacrificing himself to destroy a target that was coordinating attacks on refugee camps. Engineers built bridges and fortifications while under fire, creating defenses that let outgunned human units hold positions 10 times longer than they should have been able to. Planes and counselors worked alongside soldiers, helping Villani civilians process the trauma of everything they had witnessed. The Villani watched all of this with wonder that grew deeper every day. They had believed the Concord's warnings about humanity, had expected the violent species to be cruel and savage and dangerous to everyone around them. Instead, they saw soldiers sharing their own rations with hungry refugees even when supplies were running low. They saw Marines singing songs to frighten children to help them sleep through the noise of battle. They saw medics crying over Villani patients they could not save, mourning strangers as if they were family. High Mediator Thesley accompanied Commander Cole as he toured the front lines on the 8th day of the battle. She watched him stop to speak with wounded soldiers, calling them by name and thanking them for their service. She watched him kneel beside a dying Marine and hold the young man's hand until his eyes closed for the last time. "You weep for them," Thesley observed, seeing the tears that Cole tried to hide. "They are my people," Cole replied, his voice rough with emotion. "And they are dying for yours." Thesley did not know what to say to that, did not have words for the gratitude and confusion that filled her heart. "The Concord told us that humans were incapable of compassion," she finally said. "They told us that your species only knew how to destroy." Cole looked at her with eyes that held more sorrow and determination than she had ever seen in a living being. "We know how to destroy," he agreed, "but we choose who receives our destruction." He pointed at a group of human soldiers building shelters for Villani refugees. "Those people chose to come here," he said, "knowing they might never go home again, knowing their families might never see them alive again." His voice hardened with something that Thesley recognized as righteous anger. "They chose to die for people they have never met, people who were taught to fear them, because they heard someone crying for help and they could not stand by and do nothing." On the 9th day, Commander Cole led the final assault against the Kefir mothership. Swarm had been broken, but not defeated, and as long as the mothership survived, the Kefir would keep fighting. Cole broadcast a message to War leader Krethix, as his fleet closed in for the attack, you made a mistake, he said. You attacked people who could not fight back. The mothership opened fire with everything it had. But the human ships kept coming, and that means, Cole continued as explosions bloomed around his flagship, you have to go through us. The battle for the mothership lasted 3 hours and cost 2,000 human lives, but when it was over, the Kethver command structure had been destroyed and war leader Krethix was dead, and the swarm was fleeing Surath Prime in disarray for the first time in their history. The Kethver had been defeated and humanity had introduced itself to the galaxy in a way that no one would ever forget. The Galactic Concord Assembly Hall had never been so silent. Representatives from every major species sat in their designated sections, watching the holographic display that showed the aftermath of the Battle of Surath Primethi. Had all heard rumors about what had happened, whispered reports of the quarantine species that had broken its isolation to fight a war that was not its own. Oh, they would hear the truth from someone who had witnessed it firsthand. High Mediator Thesley walked to the center of the chamber, her bioluminescent skin glowing brighter than it had in weeks. As she faced the assembled delegatesh, could feel their discomfort, their uncertainty about how to react to events that had shattered everything they thought they knew 3 weeks ago. She began, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. I stood in the ruins of my capital city and watched my people die. She activated the display system and showed images of the Kethver invasion, the burning cities and fleeing refugees, and endless waves of enemy ships. I sent messages to every member of this Concord, begging for help, and every single one of you refused. Murmurs of discomfort rippled through the assembly. But Thesley did not pause. The Valorians were too concerned about their borders, she continued, and the Mindari were too afraid of the Kethver, and the Crystalline Collective had calculated that helping us would be strategically unwise. She looked at each delegation in turn, letting them feel the weight of their choices. You left us to die because saving us would have been inconvenient. The display changed to show human ships emerging from slipspace above her burning world. But someone else heard our cry for help, Thesley said. Someone else answered. The images showed human soldiers fighting through flames to reach trapped civilians, medics working to save wounded Valani, engineers building shelters while battle raged around them. You told us that humans were dangerous, Thesley said, and you were right. She pointed at footage of Sergeant Vasquez carrying the Valani elder through the burning forest. They are dangerous to anyone who preys on the helpless. The display showed Sergeant Okonkwo holding the mountain pass against impossible odds. You told us they were violent, Thesley continued, and you were right about that. To the images shifted to show human ships ramming Kethver vessels, soldiers fighting hand to hand against enemies twice their size. They have violence in them that none of us can match, she said, but they choose who receives it. The final images were quieter, showing human soldiers sharing food with Valani children, and Marines building schools to replace the ones that had been destroyed. 2,847 humans died on my world, Thesley said, her voice thick with emotion. They died for people they had never met, people who had been taught to fear them, people whose governments had called them monsters and locked them away from the rest of civilization. She let that number hang in the air, let it sink into the minds of delegates who had sent nothing but thoughts and prayers. Not one of those soldiers had to come, she continued. Not one of them was ordered to volunteer, and not one of them hesitated. When they heard that strangers were in danger, Thesley walked closer to the Concord leadership platform, where the representatives of the founding species watched with expressions that ranged from shame to fear. You asked me once what kind of species runs toward fire instead of away from it, she said. Now I can tell you. She turned back to face the full assembly. They are the species that hears a stranger cry for help across the stars and answers with their whole hearts, Thesley declared. They are the species that values life so deeply that they will die to protect it, even when that life is not their own. Her skin blazed with light as she spoke her final judgment. They are humanity, and they are everything you told us they were not. The chamber erupted in chaos as delegates argued and shouted and tried to process what they had heard. Some demanded that the quarantine be maintained, insisting that humans were too dangerous to be trusted. Others called for immediate diplomatic contact, recognizing that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake in the end. It was the Vellani representative who silenced them all. With a simple announcement, the Vellani Consortium is withdrawing from the Galactic Concord, Thiesley said, and we are establishing formal alliance with the United Terran Federation. The shock in the chamber was palpable as one of the oldest and most respected Concord members turned their back on the organization that had failed Theman Surath Prime. Commander Cole stood before a memorial that had been built in the central plaza of the capital city. The crystal towers were being rebuilt around him, Vellani and human engineers working side by side to restore what had been destroyed. Behind him stood statues of human soldiers, carved by Vellani artists who had wanted to honor those who had given their livest. Statues did not show warriors in poses of violence or conquest. Instead, they showed soldiers helping civilians, medics treating wounded, Marines shielding children from harm. This was how the Vellani chose to remember humanity, and Cole felt tears forming in his eyes every time he looked at them. Vellani civilians came to the memorial throughout the day, laying crystalline flowers at the feet of the statues and speaking prayers for the souls of those who had died. A young Vellani child approached Cole with a small glowing stone clutched in her hands, and she looked up at him with large dark eyes filled with curiosity. "My mother says you came from very far away," the child said, "and she says you came because we needed help." Cole knelt down so he could look at her face to face. "That is true," he said gently. The child held out the stone, a gift that Vellani gave only to those they considered true friends. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you come for us when no one else would?" Cole took the stone and felt its warmth against his palm, thinking about all the soldiers who had volunteered, all the medics who had worked until they collapsed, all the pilots who had flown into impossible odds. Thought about Elena Vasquez, who was still recovering from her wounds, and James Okonkwo, who had been promoted for his impossible defense, and Sarah Chen, who had become the first human expert in Vellani medicine. He thought about the 2,847 graves that now rested on this alien world, each one marking a human who had chosen to die so that strangers could live. "Because you needed us," Cole said simply, and that was enough. The child smiled and hugged him, and Cole held her gently as he looked up at the statues of his fallen soldiers. Some of them, human and Vellani ships, patrolled together through skies that were blue and clear for the first time in weeks. The beginning of an alliance that would reshape the galaxy had been written in blood and fire and sacrifice. Concord had called humanity monsters, and they had been right in ways they never understood. Becques, sometimes the universe needs monster sometimes it needs creatures who will run toward fire instead of away from it. Sometimes it needs a species that will hear a cry for help from across the stars and answer with everything they have. If Kethver had learned this lesson at the cost of their empire, Concord was learning it now at the cost of their pretty. And as more species began reaching out to the humans who had defied everything the galaxy believed about them, one truth became clear to everyone: when the universe is dark and hope is dying and no one else will answer, humanity will come through the flames, through the fire, through whatever stands between them and those who need protection. That is what monsters look like, and the galaxy would never forget it.